Okay, it didn't pop up this time. All right.
No.
All right. Well, welcome everybody to the Tri-County Foster Care Coalition's training, our Foster Care Fridays. Today we have for Human Trafficking Awareness Month in January of this year, we have Sanctum House here to be able to talk to us about human trafficking in the state of Michigan and just different things that they are doing to be able to impact our victims and our survivors in our state. And with us today, we have Erica Watkins, who's the Director of Integrated Care at Sanctum House, and actually they're from the start of Sanctum House, which their anniversary of 6 years is February 12th. So we're so excited for them to be able to celebrate that amazing milestone. I know she was a part of like the creating of the programs and policies and all of that with Sanctum House. So we're real excited to be able to have her here to be able to share about the programs and services that they offer and just human trafficking in Michigan and how we can get involved as foster families, as the community at large. So without further ado, Erica, take over.
Thanks so much, Sean. I'm super excited to be here. I appreciate you all for inviting Sanctum House. And also, I just appreciate you all's willingness to talk about this topic. Human trafficking is, I'd say, an epidemic, and it really plagues anyone that has any level of vulnerability. So I'm excited to be here. I started my journey in foster care. I was a foster care adoption worker. And that birthed kind of my interest in trafficking, because what we were starting to notice is many youth in foster care that were aging out were unable to be located. Youth that were in foster care were AWOL and couldn't be found. And we started to learn about trafficking and kind of what was happening with youth that were vulnerable and ultimately being exploited. And so that led me into teaming up with the ladies over at Sanctum House and us opening up Sanctum House. But it all started for me in foster care adoption. So I thought that was something I should share. I was also raised in a family that did foster care for my entire life. And I have some adopted siblings. So the system in general, I'm very familiar with. And then I worked in it, and then it birthed kind of my relationship with trafficking and the work that I'm doing now. So super excited to be here. I plan to kind of talk a bit about trafficking, what it is, what you can do, some signs and indicators, and then we'll take a brief moment to maybe have some questions. And then I'll tell you guys also a little bit more about Sanctum House and just the work that we're doing. So we often will ask ourselves kind of, what is it that we know about trafficking, right? We see things in the media, we see things on television, we're hearing things on podcasts. The one thing that we know ultimately is that trafficking has to involve force, fraud, or coercion. So the United States defines sex trafficking as a commercial sex act in which it is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person that performed the act has not obtained the age of 18 years of age. So if the person is under the age of 18, it does not have to include force, fraud, or coercion to be considered trafficking if someone is being sexually exploited or performing commercial sex acts. If they're over the age of 18, it has to include one of those three, the force, fraud, or coercion, to be considered human trafficking. So force could be physical force, fraud could be false promises, coercion could be the use of substances to coerce someone to perform a commercial sex act. So we were really excited when that law passed regarding coercion and using substances for coercion, because we all kind of knew that was happening, but it wasn't written into law. And so 2018, that law was passed. And so many people that were being coerced who may have already had a substance use disorder and traffickers were using that to exploit people can now be actually charged with human trafficking for that. So we were really excited about that. It's important to consider that there's an umbrella when we talk about human trafficking. And most times when we talk about human trafficking, we automatically think sex trafficking, but there's actually sex trafficking and there's labor trafficking. So I defined sex trafficking already, and now I'm going to define labor. It's the recruitment, harbor, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion for the purposes of subjection to involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. So some ways you may see labor trafficking may be in massage parlors. Michigan has a really large farming industry where we're finding a lot of labor trafficking, often in restaurants or, like I said, massage parlors. So labor trafficking can really show up in many different ways, but it has to include force, fraud, or coercion in order to be considered human trafficking. When I think about what human trafficking is, and when we talk about it at Sanctum House, the one key element to human trafficking and someone being exploited is vulnerability. And so, for those of you working in the foster care field or child welfare, one of the things we know is those youth in general have vulnerabilities, right? Whether it's a lack of support, whether they age out of foster care and it's housing, whether it's financial instability, whether it's various mental health disorders, whether they're struggling with substance use disorders. Vulnerabilities leave someone prey to a trafficker to be exploited. At Sanctum House, we've worked with women that have had all different types of lifestyles, practicing attorneys, practicing nurses, people who had children. I think we have to kind of dispel some of the myths that it only can happen to this type of a person, or it can only happen to that kind of a person. Ultimately, as humans, we have varying types of vulnerabilities, and traffickers' job is to figure out what that is and then exploit that to take advantage of a person. So, one of the things we talk about a lot at Sanctum House is kind of just dispelling some of the myths of what we think a trafficking victim looks like. So we're not narrowing our view. And so we're looking at anyone that could potentially be a victim of trafficking if they have a vulnerability. We often use some of, not so much use, but we share the stories of some of the ladies that we've worked with just because we feel they're the experts in this field. And so one of the survivors that we worked with said, I felt powerless all the time, growing up in an alcoholic, abusive home. I just felt lost and powerless, being abused by my father sexually, physically, mentally, not understanding and not having any support from my mom, who basically facilitated the abuse. There was no place to turn back in my day and age. You were just on your own. So I was pretty powerless. And this was from Dawn, and she was a Sanctum House survivor. So that powerlessness, right, is a vulnerability. Dawn started out early with physical abuse, violence in the home, not feeling supported by her parents. So that's a vulnerability that a trafficker could exploit. Some of the push factors and other vulnerabilities that we have found would be substance use disorders or drug use concerns, housing insecurity and homelessness, poverty or economic conditions, and then other factors I would factor in mental health disorders in a major way. So at Sanctum House, a lot of what we have seen with survivors is a co-occurring disorder of mental health and substance use. And I'm sure for those of you in child welfare, as youth age, you might see that as well. And so that's just an area where we're seeing that vulnerability that is being exploited by traffickers. And these are just push factors and vulnerabilities, not necessarily saying that for sure if you have these things, you'll be trafficked, but just some factors that we have found to make it more likely. So we often see these images, right, with the white van pulling up and the person, abducting someone, and that's trafficking. And I am going to say that I am sure that that does happen from time to time, but the reality is research is indicating, and when you talk to lived experience experts and survivors, most times people are trafficked by someone that they know. So a trafficker can be any gender, race, ethnicity. They are sharing a role of power over another person and exploiting that vulnerability. So for labor trafficking, you may see a business owner or that person running that farm could be the trafficker. Often we've seen it be friends. We've had ladies that we've worked with that were exchanged for drugs to a trafficker from someone that they considered a friend. This is my girlfriend. Oh, we're going to hang out. Next thing you know, the friend sells her in exchange for drugs to a trafficker. Families, parents, or guardians, so working in child welfare, just being mindful that there are many incidents and many ladies that we've worked with who were actually trafficked by family members, by their parents, by their mother's boyfriend, just to give some examples, or a spouse or an intimate partner. So often, you'll hear the term the Romeo pimp, where a trafficker um, will defraud a person by pretending to have a romantic relationship with them in order to ultimately exploit them and convince them to be trafficked. So that intimate partner or that spouse. And we have seen it where a trafficker has actually married the traffickee. So that is not uncommon. It does allow for that power and control element, which is ultimately what the traffickers want. Um, Another survivor noted, I felt neglected in my relationship with my trafficker. My trafficker was my everything. And this was Bianca shared this element of her story. And so creating that element of codependence is what traffickers can often do, especially in that intimate relationship where that person feels codependent on the trafficker and thus you need them for everything. And so, how is there a way I could leave when I need you for everything? Some common indicators, excuse me, that we found in human trafficking. We already kind of talked about housing a bit. So an unstable living situation. If a caregiver or family member who has a substance use disorder, so working in child welfare, there's many times where the parents may have that. And so just keeping an eye on the children that you're caring for doesn't mean that they will be trafficked. It's just an indicator that it could happen. Undocumented immigrants, we see that a lot in regards to labor trafficking. Traffickers will use that to exploit a person and defraud them, take their documents and say, oh, we're going to get you deported if you don't do this, if you don't do that. If a person has a history of sexual abuse, if a person has a history of domestic violence, if they're a runaway or involved in the juvenile justice or foster care system. So if you're a worker, keeping that in mind. And if you're a family supporting a child in the system, just keeping that in mind. If someone is facing poverty or economic need, of course, that's a natural vulnerability. If someone is addicted to drugs or alcohol and struggling in their substance use disorder, just keeping that in mind in terms of indicators. Another resident survivor stated, in the streets, a lot of people would act like I mattered, but then they would put me on the back burner. They would for a second be like, oh, we're going to take care of this and that, and we're going to do this, whatever. And it never happened. So kind of those false promises, those we're going to take care of you. For Dara specifically, she didn't have a lot of familiar support. So she'll tell you kind of the streets raised me. And so for her, she trusted these people to take care of her, kind of like her family, because she didn't have that familiar support. And so they'll tell you that they're going to do things for you, but that really never happens. And that's kind of what Dara was sharing in her story. So it's kind of fun sometimes to take a look at our home state. So you see the beautiful mitten of Michigan. What you'll notice, what I'd like to draw your attention to at least, are the red areas are the hotter spots for trafficking. So if you look down into the mitten, going down below the thumb, you'll kind of see where there are hotter areas where we're finding trafficking. This data was collected through the National Human Trafficking Hotline. This was from 2019 and 2020. But just to kind of give you an indicator of what has been going on in Michigan, because often it's easy to say, oh, trafficking is happening over there, or trafficking is happening internationally. But the reality is we have to start to settle within ourselves that trafficking is happening right here among us. And so the National Human Trafficking Hotline does an excellent job of collecting data, but I do want to let you know that these numbers only indicate what was actually reported. So it doesn't necessarily mean this is all the trafficking happening in Michigan. This is the trafficking that is being reported in Michigan. So 2019, there were 813 victims of trafficking that were actually identified by way of reporting through the hotline. 153 traffickers and 62 trafficking businesses were identified. That's a lot. In 2020, Michigan received an F from the Polaris Project in criminal record relief for trafficking survivors. So there was a while where it was really difficult for trafficking survivors to be able to navigate the legal system. We'll find that lots of survivors draw lots of criminal charges while being involved in trafficking. The trafficker will send them to do things. They end up getting arrested. Of course, they take the rap and they end up getting this long rap sheet. And so what I would say is pretty awesome is in recent years, the Joseph Project is an organization partnered with the Michigan Bar. And so they provide free pro bono legal services from really top-notch attorneys to help survivors to be able to tackle those legal issues. And we've seen expungements, we've seen reconciliation of parenting time with children, we've seen driving records clear, we've seen, just all types of things. So I would argue that this number is actually probably better in terms of the rating that they received here in Michigan because of the Joseph Project and the work they've been doing. Also, the U of M Law Clinic does excellent work. Also in West Michigan, Kalamazoo, YWCA does a lot of really great work as well. So I just want to acknowledge those organizations too. In 2020, some of the top recruitment locations, and if we think about this, we were right in the thick of COVID, was the internet ultimately. So Facebook, unspecified internet would be like Plenty of Fish, OnlyFans, Tinder, and then Instagram. So if you have a youth in your home or that you're working with, I will be very, very careful in monitoring social media. And a lot of the sites that seem innocent and that don't seem like there's really anything going on that's inappropriate, there's lots of ways for traffickers to kind of weasel their way in. So my encouragement, if you're a parent or even as a worker and working with the youth, is to really try to give a lot of support when it comes to social media, because traffickers have gotten really smart in terms of using social media as a very easy way to lure people in and exploit them. Some of the top vulnerabilities that were identified in Michigan was relocation. And you'll notice that just in regards to transient. So trafficking individuals are often very transient because traffickers will move them around because it's harder to identify a trafficking victim if they don't stay in the same place too long. Substance use concerns or disorders at 10%, unstable housing at 9%, homeless youth 8%. So that could be youth that were in the foster care system, aged out. It could be youth that are still in the foster care system and are AWOL. It could be just other youth that are homeless and on the street. And then mental health concerns or disorders at 7%. So these are just some of the top vulnerabilities that were identified through the hotline in our state. So I always think it's great to kind of talk about where we live and what's happening right around us. So it gives us an idea of things that we can be keeping an eye on and that we can be doing. One of the things Sanctum House has dived a bit into recently is the racial disparity in trafficking. So we know that trafficking is happening. We know that it is a bit of an epidemic. But what we're starting to learn is that there are also like systemic issues within trafficking that bring further disparities. And one of the which we found to be pretty egregious is the racial disparity. And so we've been diving into that. The Department of Justice Bureau of Statistics found that between 2008 and 2010, 358 out of 460 cases of child sex trafficking involved non-white children. So that percentage of children that were found being trafficked was 77.8% were children of color. So just to give you an idea of that disparity. So 77.8% of all the children that were identified during that time were non-white or children of color. So just kind of, it doesn't necessarily, trafficking can happen to anyone, but what we're seeing is that there is a disparity in regards to trafficking happening more often and more likely to children or even people of color. And so just keeping that in your mind as a parent, keeping that in your mind as a worker, and really systemically, we're really trying to look at ways in which we can solve that and fix it, bridge that gap. There's an excellent article if you're interested to really dive into the racial disparity of trafficking that was written by Cheryl Nelson Butler. It's called The Racial Roots of Human Trafficking. It's an excellent article. And what I like about the article is outside of just talking about the issue and disparity, she also talks about some really tangible things that you can do. So I would suggest it if you're wanting to dive deeper into the topic. She noted that race intersects with other forms of subordination, including gender, class, and age. to push people of color disproportionately into prostitution and keep them trapped in the commercial sex industry. So, just kind of talking about some of the systemic issues that push people of color disproportionately to find themselves exploited by way of trafficking or the commercial sex industry. So, we always like to just bring that up to make sure that we're being transparent in regards to trafficking and the things that we can do, because that's the reason why we all come together for things like this, is because obviously, one, we care, and two, we want to do something about it. So you may ask yourself, what can you do to help fight trafficking? And there are lots of tangible things you can do. Often people will wonder, well, what happens if I run into someone that I think is being trafficked? So I'm going to just give you a few tips. And I will say that most of these tips were received from trafficking survivors themselves. So we try to make sure we're asking them, well, how would you have wanted someone, to speak to you, or would you have wanted them to speak to you? So some of the tips that were given to us by the experts was to actively listen. So if you think you're coming in contact with someone, whether it's a youth on your caseload, a child placed in your home, a relative, someone you just see out and about, you want to, if you're engaging with them in conversation, make sure you're listening. It's the worst thing you do to ask somebody questions or engage, but then not actually listen. You observe your surroundings, right? Safety is really important. So you want to make sure it's safe to even engage. You can try to build a rapport over time. So often when we're talking to like school teachers, or if you're a worker and you have a client or a child on your caseload, building that rapport for them to be able to feel comfortable to share maybe what they've been experiencing. And then if it's safe, you can try to ask really clear questions. Is there anything that I can do to help you? Do you feel safe in whatever is the current situation? And what do you need? That was one of the main things that one of the survivors we worked with said, is that so many times there were people that wanted to help or do good by her, but never really asked her what it is she needed, just assumed they knew what she needed. So always asking is really empowering, and I think makes a person feel validated and heard. Um, if that person that you encountered, or you're working with a client, or you have a youth and they're really not giving any information, saying, no, I'm fine, everything's good, but you're still concerned, you can always give out the hotline number. So it's 888-373-7888. And the great thing about the hotline is that you can call it and it's kind of tracked. So if you call and just say, hey, I have a kiddo on my caseload, I've been, working with them, and I'm really concerned that they may be being trafficked or exploited. Um, they can also give you resources, but they can track it. So if this keeps coming up, there's a tracking system, which I think is pretty cool. Also, for youth and other individuals that just prefer to text, there is also a text feature. So you can text Be Free to 233-733, and they will text you back. So just so you know, I've tried all of these features, because one thing I have found in working with survivors is that building of trust can be really quickly broken. So I have tried calling the hotline as well as texting the number, just to kind of see what is the outcome. I have found texting to be much faster. They respond very quickly, and kind of point you in the right direction really fast. Calling takes a little bit longer, but for some people, it's their preference to talk to someone. But I want to make sure you guys have this information, because you can always plant a seed. So you don't have to fully know the whole entire story of what's going on with someone, or if there's a youth on your caseload you're concerned about and they're just not ready to open up. You don't have to know the whole story to say, hey, if it comes up for you and you want to call and get some help, here's a number you can call, or here's a number you can text and talk to somebody about what you've been going through. So I think the hotline is phenomenal. They also have a plethora of resources. So if you have a kiddo on your caseload, or a kiddo that's in your home, and you need some resources, and that might not mean you need housing. Let's just say that youth is still living in your home, but you want, a therapist that specializes in trafficking, or you want to see if there's like a support group for that youth. You can also contact the hotline for those resources and support as well. So I wanted to make sure that I left that with you all. So you do have that resource. Sanctum House is also a resource, and I'm going to share a little bit about that, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to first see if there's any questions on what we've talked about so far before I kind of share a little bit about Sanctum House, and what we do, and kind of some of the um, great stories that we've seen of survivorship. So does anybody have any questions, thoughts, concerns?
I don't really have a question, but I do think that the information you shared is extremely important, and I would like to see if you could do it for our workers at our agency. Because I
Yeah,
don't think we think a lot that in terms of foster children, how vulnerable that they are in regards to sex trafficking, and then like what we can do, what we should be aware of, even as you said, the social media thing, monitoring that
mhm,
with our kids, because I mean we hear that a lot in terms of
yeah,
their predators out there, but I think to hear from someone who's working in the field, our workers could really benefit from that and the practical tips that you shared.
awesome. Yeah, I'd love to come and share. Thank you.
Absolutely, I completely agree. I mean, with foster care, we're dealing with so many issues and so many things to try to make sure that they are comfortable in their homes and they have all their services set up. At the human trafficking aspect of it, especially since they just kind of naturally get a lot of those red flags because they're pulled from their families and they're no longer in the same type of supports that they would, have in their biological homes, that it makes them easier victims of
Yeah,
trafficking. So just to have that in the like the forefront of your awareness as a foster parent, as a worker, the fact that our kids are exceptionally vulnerable to this, and we need to be aware of this information as much as possible so that we can step in and kind of lower some of those red flags if at all possible, of course.
Mhm.
absolutely. And I mean, I think it just helps, like you said, to have that knowledge and information. It doesn't mean every youth that's been in foster care is going to be trafficked. But like you say, Sean, there is just a higher level of vulnerability. So knowing what some of the signs are, paying extra close attention. Social media it's skyrocketing. There's so many ways to utilize it. And I'm still learning. Some of the residents, they show me things and I'm like, how did you do that? And they're like, oh, you can do this and do that. And so there's just so many ways it can be used. And I think that if we keep educating, keep making ourselves aware, and keep working together as a community, we can really wrap our arms around this issue and really start to tackle it. And that's what we're trying to do. So
Absolutely.
happy to share.
Couldn't agree more. Well, thank you so much for all this information. This will be just
Yeah,
a great thing again to be able to share with foster families and workers and anybody, even in the community, that just want to learn a little bit more. The more educated we can become, the less easy that it becomes to actually participate in these things for people that find themselves in that situation. So definitely,
absolutely.
knowledge is power. So
Yes, it is. I would say that I do want to share just a little bit about Sanctum House, if I could,
yeah,
just really quickly.
absolutely.
And then I can give my contact information. So if anybody wants to talk more or want more information, have some questions, I'm always happy to kind of help with that. But so Sanctum House is it's a 18 to 24 month integrated care shelter program for adult women survivors of trafficking. We have been open, as you mentioned from the beginning, Sean, for our 6-year anniversary. It'll be February 12th. We're super excited about that. We have had the honor of servicing hundreds of women. And one of the things I just like to share is that I think it's important to note that Sanctum House, it considers itself a sanctuary for survivors, but the survivors are doing the work. So there's no rescuing someone, right? And you'll hear people say that, but the reality is, survivors are doing the work and really being brave and courageous in terms of tackling trauma, right? And complex trauma in order to be able to move forward with their lives. So it's an integrated care program. So we've learned a lot along the way and added more programming to make sure that we're meeting the survivors' needs. But ultimately, we provide mental health care, physical health care, dental, vision. We have a really strong and robust recovery program because we learned early on that that was really important. Um, we work with varying co-occurring disorders with mental health or substance abuse disorder. So we try to make sure that that's a really strong part of the program. But what we learned also early were physical ailments have a way of, and I learned this actually in child welfare, but physical ailments have a way of displaying themselves right when you're no longer in that fight, flight, or freeze mode. Your body is like, oh, I have ailments that I need addressed. I'm sick, you know. And so one of the things we learned quickly at Sanctum House is when the survivors were no longer in that like fight, flight, or freeze mode, and that comes down, a lot of their physical ailments will reveal themselves. And so we partner with Trinity Health in regards to physical health, and they've been really great partners. But we also work on life skills. We really have a strong trauma-based therapeutic program. And we try to make sure that we're working not just for ladies to feel like survivors. And you will hear, I should say this, I want to say this real quick. Sorry, this came on my mind. Sometimes people talk about survivors, and some people, you'll hear people say victims. You're going to sometimes hear me interchange the words, but the reason I do that is because I do think it's really important that you honor the person where they are on their journey. And there's many times where I've met ladies that have come into Sanctum House and they're like, you know, I'm no victim, you know, I survived. And then you'll meet someone else and they're like, I don't even know if I was trafficked. He just told me he was my boyfriend, you know, right? And so there's like, so there's such a big spectrum of where someone can be on their journey. And so I kind of let the survivor tell me where they feel they are. If they feel they're still a victim and still working towards being a survivor, I'll meet you there. If you think you're a survivor and you made it and you have more on your journey you want to do, then we'll say survivor. Now the term some people are using is lived experience expert. I'm an expert now, right? I've gone through my trauma. I've gone through my therapeutic process. I'm in my sobriety for years, you know, and I'm the expert on my journey. So I just want to say that you may hear me sometimes use those terms interchangeably, and I only do that because I just try to honor the person in regards to where they are on the journey. And at Sanctum House, because the program is long, you know, you may have some ladies that are there on their way out and they're like, I'm a survivor. I made it. I'm going out. And then you have other ladies coming in that still are still feeling as they're a victim, you know, or even just trying to acknowledge that they were trafficked, because often traffickers are such good manipulators that many times the ladies we've had come in don't even see themselves as a victim. They don't even recognize that they have been trafficked. So that's just really important to say. But Sanctum House also does education and awareness if that's needed in the community. We partner with the Joseph Project in regards to legal. So we have had lots of legal matters. Hello, daughter. Legal matters that we have had expunged and things like that for ladies. A lot of family reunification, because you can imagine what the complexity of the trauma of trafficking can do to a family, especially if it's a woman who has children. She may have lost her rights. The children may be in guardianship. They may be in foster care. So you may have, just say it because I was a foster care adoption worker. You may have a birth parent, right, that may have been being trafficked. So how do you navigate that? How can you support her or him, you know, through that process? And I should say also that Sanctum House specifically right now works with adult women. We are looking to expand our population this year, but women are not the only people that are trafficked. So there are men that are trafficked, there are children, there are girls, there are boys that are trafficked. So right now, that's the population that we started out serving, because we wanted to make sure that we created a program that was going to set someone up to be successful. And now we kind of have it. And now we're starting to kind of duplicate it for different populations. So I just think it's important to say it's not only women. There are men who are trafficked, and there are boys who are trafficked. So just as a worker or as a foster parent, keeping that in mind as well. But I'll give my information. Again, my name is Erica Watkins, Director of Integrated Care at Sanctum House, which is in Oakland County. We don't disclose the address because it's a safe house, but I can give you the phone number. And it's 248-574-9373. And our website is sanctumhouse.org. So we're also always accepting volunteers if it's something you're interested in. But if you need more information, or you have questions about something, or you think you may have a client that is in need of our services, please don't hesitate to give a call, and we're always happy to help.
I was just about to ask for your contact information, just in case. I mean, you have people who want to be able to volunteer or to be able to assist in that way, but maybe they can't go that far and they'd be willing to donate, or they'd be willing to, donate services or even, financial support. So definitely follow that website. We will put that information in the comment section of this video, so you'll be able to locate the website and the phone number that way as well. And for those of you that are on here that are not licensed foster parents or adoptive parents, there are ways that you can get involved in that aspect too, to be able to be a parent for these kids that are in these vulnerable populations that need those safe, caring, nurturing, loving homes, whether temporary or even forever families. And you can find more information on the Foster Care Navigator website. That's fcnp.org, which we will also put in the comments section, or you can call 855-MISH-KIDS. Thank you so much for joining us. For those of you,
I want to say one thing,
Oh,
Sean,
go
before
ahead.
you close out, because based off what you just said, sorry, just hit me on the nerve. Just hit me. You being a foster parent could be the difference to that vulnerability for that kid. I'm just saying.
Absolutely.
So we're going to talk about trafficking and ways in which we want to, we all want to make it stop. Be a foster parent.
Absolutely. All these kids need somebody that can support them, that can care for them, that can keep them safe. That is hope for every child in the state of Michigan, and we will get there. So
absolutely,
we need your help.
Yes.
Okay, so thank you again for joining us for this training. Thank you, Erica, for this valuable information. This is incredible. And thank you, Missy, for bringing us this resource. We really appreciate it so much. At Bethany Christian Services as well for, loaning us this great presentation today and connecting us. For those of you that are licensed foster parents and you're using this training for training hours, in the comment section will also be a link for you to be able to complete your training questionnaire to be able to get your certificate. So don't forget to do that so that you can get counted for your training hours for completing it today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.